Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview brought to you in association with the Brussels Forum. I'm joined today by the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. Yeah. Now, you've written this book, Beyond the Crash, which is very different to the one written by Tony Blair, not a defence of your premiership, but rather an account of its defining moment.
I wanted to write specifically about the financial crisis because I want us to learn lessons quickly from what happened, what went wrong and what actually went right in trying to deal with the crisis. And I think it's incredibly important because we're in this huge transition. We've had this 20-year period where the productive potential and power of Asia has grown, the power of Brazil, Russia, China, India, but also Asia as a whole. Europe and America have got a smaller share of world output and world production. And we're about to enter another 10, 20 years where the issue of consumption is going to be the main thing. Middle-class consumers in Asia and in the rest of the world, growing in number, billions of them, and that will change the world economy again. Now, the question is, what are the policies that are most guaranteed to secure jobs, prosperity, environmental care, and how can we internationally agree to do what we might achieve better by cooperation than just by acting in isolation?
Now, of course, what you do at the beginning of the book is to go back over those crucial events after the collapse of Lehman Brothers when you were Prime Minister, those crucial months when it is widely recognised, the consensus is that, and you are credited often with being the man who saved capitalism, in a sense, who saved the system, who saw that what was needed were injections of capital, what was needed were stimulus plans, but also the crucial notion of recapitalisation, and, of course, crucially, the fact that we needed to work together. This had to be, global solutions had to be found to these issues. So lots of support, lots of admiration for what you had to do, which never quite translated into admiration at home. Why do you think that is?
I think when you're dealing with global problems, it's difficult to explain that to a national audience. So, you know, we had a global financial problem that couldn't be dealt with simply by local action. You had to deal with it at an international level. You had to deal with it with governments cooperating together. And equally at the same time, we had a problem about getting out of recession, and you had to have coordinated international action to do so. But how do you then explain to the general public of your country that this is an international problem, it's a global problem, when most people see it as a national problem? They see it as something that has got to be dealt with in their own home territory. They see it as something that really, if you don't have an instant national answer, then you probably don't have an answer at all. And I think there's an anti-incumbency factor around the world. I mean, basically, governments in the industrialized countries who've been dealing with this financial crisis, whether it's the American congressional elections, or whether it's what happened in the Japanese elections, or happened in the Australian elections, or the rise of anti-immigrant parties right across Europe, there has been a protectionism, and therefore, governments have been penalized because of the crisis and because people want national solutions when actually you've got to be honest with people. Some of these problems can only be solved globally.
Now, of course, there is also an irony insofar as, in all this, insofar it was the moment when you stepped in and did these things that are widely recognised to have saved the system. And yet, of course, you'd been Chancellor for 10 years before that, and you'd been a very active Chancellor. There must be a number of things that you wish you'd done differently.
Well, of course. I mean, we were dealing in Britain, like the industrialised world, with a problem of inflation initially. So for 50 years, particularly in Britain, you had these stop-go, boom-bust economies that were based on inflation getting out of control, governments having to raise interest rates, the economy moving into recession, high rate levels of unemployment, until you could get inflation down. So for 50 years, inflation was the biggest problem facing an economy like Britain. What we hadn't realised was just how entangled the world's banking and financial system had become. And so while we were all expecting the next crisis to arise from an inflationary problem, there was a stability problem that arose from the interlocking nature of the financial institutions. So while it started in America, of course, half the subprime mortgages were bought by European banks. But we didn't have anything other than national supervision, and it was quite incapable of dealing with the problem. Now, to be fair to me, I'd said in 1998, after the Asian crisis, we needed to build this global financial system. But I couldn't get support from people to do so. And we didn't even have an early warning system in place for the big financial for the big industrial countries. So the lesson of the Asian crisis was not properly learned, and now we've got to learn this lesson. You need global financial supervision, so you need global standards that everybody will apply. You need rules that are monitored not just nationally but by international institutions, and you need an early warning system so that you can actually see the vulnerabilities and act before things go wrong.
Now, one example of all that is, of course, what's happening in Europe now. We've just come up with this, the Europeans have come up with this, this debt deal, and yet the spectre of another European country, a third one, having to seek a bailout remains in place. Does all that's happened in the last few months within the Eurozone confirm your instinct that, in fact, Britain is better out than in?
I don't think Britain would have done very well inside the Euro in the time that it might have been in. And the reason is that the Euro has to set an interest rate for the whole of Europe, and it would undoubtedly have not been the right interest rate for Britain. So you've got to remember, if you join the Euro, you don't have currency flexibility, so you can't change your exchange rate, you can't devalue. You don't have interest rate flexibility, so you've got to have the same interest rate that is operating right across the board in Europe, and is going to be geared to what is the best for Europe and not just for one country. And if you don't then have wage flexibility or labour market flexibility at the level that, for example, the Americans have, where people are prepared to move from one part of America to another part of America if there's a crisis, if Massachusetts is doing badly, then people move to California or vice versa, then there are difficult problems that each country has to deal with. And in fact, at the time...
You'd identified them 13 years ago when Labour first came to power, and all these things came to pass.
I said that I didn't think the Euro could work for Britain. I think it would be a disaster if the Euro couldn't continue to function and be made more successful in the future. Technically, the Euro has been a success, but of course, the inability to adjust quickly, which is really the problem that Portugal and Greece and Ireland are now facing. They can't adjust their economies quickly enough. Raises big problems about how the Euro is going to work in the future.
Do you think that the Euro can survive, will survive this crisis?
Yes, I think it will. Look, there's three problems in the Euro area. One is the large deficits. The second is the scale of banking liabilities. And the third is the lack of growth. Now, you've got to have a strategy that deals with these three problems in one. But there is a huge political investment in the Euro. Remember, you do cut currency transaction costs. You do speed up trade. It does lead to higher growth. If you can solve the problems about the way the Euro works, and that means that you're going to have greater flexibilities somewhere, and I think that can be done, then the Euro can survive. But the key issue at the moment is finding a way of dealing with these three problems. Still large bank liabilities, still problems of very low growth and high unemployment, as well as deficits. You've got to have a strategy that deals with these three together. You can't solve them on their own. You've got to deal with it as an entity. But I wouldn't underestimate the problem of the banking system, and I think that is still something that has got to be properly dealt with. I would say that in general, European banks are undercapitalised, that their leverage ratios remain very high, and I think the danger is that problem is solved simply by not lending enough to businesses and therefore discouraging economic growth.
Now, of course, one can't help but, I suppose, once one's been Prime Minister, but continue to be a sort of backseat driver and keep an eye on what others are doing, faced with those circumstances.
I'm not really interested in being a backseat driver. I mean, I'm not talking about national politics, and I'm not going to.
But your book it does not only look back, but it looks ahead to what needs to be done now.
At a global and international level.
How far in that direction are we going? What do governments need to be doing that they are not?
Well, first of all, they should recognise that when there are global problems that are common to each country, they should cooperate. Now, if you look around the world at the moment, and President Sarkozy has recognised this with his agenda for the G20, you've got a common problem with food price rises. You've got a shared problem also with the level of oil price volatility, and now a nuclear issue that's got to be dealt with, which raises the question again about a climate change agreement. You've got, unfortunately, still low standards in a number of countries in dealing with banking problems, and therefore you have a potential for another financial crisis if things are not done. And you've got low growth generally in Europe and America, and probably a peak of growth has been reached in China and in some other countries in Asia. So you probably are going to have a world economy that's growing at less than its optimal value. And at the same time, large numbers, millions of young people unemployed. Now, these are shared problems. You can't solve them only in one country. They are shared problems that can be dealt with by a greater degree of international cooperation. And I would have thought myself, with the work that I've done, that if you could have a degree of cooperation that is not in existence at the moment to the level that is required, you could probably see the world economy grow by 3 or 4% faster by 2014. You could probably get 25 to 50 million people in jobs. You could take poverty in the poorer countries down by several tens, maybe hundreds of millions. There are things that you could do by international cooperation that you can't do by acting on your own. And therefore my plea is, in a sense, that we look at the institutions that make possible global cooperation and make them work more effectively.
With, of course, the difficulty that there will always be national resistance, with the difficulty that the banking sector will not wish to be better regulated or more regulated, there are inherent resistances within the system.
Yeah, but if you take business, I mean, yes, I think the reason that business, which has gone global, has not wanted, if you like, the supervision to go global is that they just don't want regulation. But I think if you're an industrial company or a service company and you see what happened to the banks, you want to remove an avoidable risk to your stability, your prosperity. And one of the avoidable risks that you can remove is the instability in the banking system. Now, therefore, as a business, you would want to promote greater cooperation around the world in setting banking standards and in also regulating and supervising global financial institutions. So I would have thought most of the public would want us to take action to deal with a global problem in our financial institutions, and I would have thought you could win support for that. But I do agree it's difficult on other issues to win public support, because people want there to be an easier national solution to a problem. And in fact, politicians define the problem as being a national problem because it's a lot easier for them to deal with.
Given all there was left given all there is left to do, I wonder what regrets you have about, for instance, not having held a snap election back in 2007, when you might have. What regrets do you have of your time when you were Prime Minister that might have seen things go the other way?
I don't think it's possible to look back in that way. I think the defining issue of the last few years has been the economic and financial crisis. I think that even governments who've dealt with it in the way that has avoided the deepest of recessions, and certainly in Britain we kept unemployment a lot lower than the rest of the world. But even governments who've dealt with the problems have been, if you like, rejected because there is an anti-incumbency factor. And I think it's true around the world. And I think the danger is that you have this, every year people want change, when actually the problem that we are dealing with is that we have got to master that change.
I wonder, finally, what is next for you personally? You've taken to the backbenches, you've written this book. There is life, you said, after Downing Street. What plans do you have for the future?
I've got a very young family. I've got children of 7 and 4, so I've got a chance to be reunited with them. And I'm doing a big report on global education, because I really feel that the Millennium Development Goals that we set for the world are not going to be met by 2015 as we plan to do so, unless there is a dramatic shift in how we go about it. And I think the education goal that every child goes to school is an attainable goal, but there are still 70 million children not at school. So I'm using a lot of my efforts to try to persuade countries and to show that it can be done to get every child into education. So we need more teachers. We need to use our teachers better. We need obviously better school buildings, but we also need a culture in a lot of countries where they want to encourage that learning, which is, if you look at the Middle East at the moment, or if you look at North Africa, if we cannot find and unlock the door to opportunity for young people in these areas, then you can have changes of government and changes of regime, but the problem will remain the same. And therefore, there is a premium, in my view, on finding a way to get young people into training education and to get them qualifications, and at the same time get them jobs for the future. And that's one of the things that I think I can help on doing.
Gordon Brown, thanks very much for having been with us. That's all there's time for on this interview. We'll be back very soon, though, with another. Do stay with us.